In this video, I'm going to demonstrate how to set up the camera in Modo. So I'm going to switch to a preview render viewport and I'm going to run preview. And currently the camera is using the default settings, but these aren't the most realistic. They're mostly what I would call draft settings. So I'm going to switch to the Scenes tab with the item list in it, and I'm going to select the camera in the item list. Then I'm going to switch to the camera effects, and I'm going to enable depth of field. Now everything immediately goes out of focus, as you can see, but it's really easy to refocus. All you need to do is just to hover your mouse over the point on which you want the camera to focus and then hit Ctrl F, and that will focus the camera on that point under your cursor. Now once you enable depth of field, the default f-stop is 4.0. And that's a little bit too low because, as you can see, the depth of field effect is way too strong for this particular shot. So I'm going to increase the f-stop all the way up to 11, and that's going to make the depth of field effect much more subtle. But having some depth of field, I think, does add to the realism of the shot. Now, one thing you might notice is that if I reduce the shutter speed, let's say I halve it to 1/24th of a second, this has absolutely no effect on the scene at the moment. And that's because by default, the exposure is not controlled by the camera, but we can change that. To do this, I'm going to switch to the Shading tab, and I'm going to select the final color output at the top of the shader tree. And in the Properties panel, where it says Exposure Control, I'm going to change it from the default of white level to photographic. Now that immediately darkens the scene. Because with the settings as they are, there is not enough light reaching the camera. And there's two ways that we can increase the exposure without changing the aperture, which we've already set to f11. These are to increase the film speed, so let's increase it all the way to 800. And as you can see, that helps to brighten the scene. And the other thing we can do is return to the camera in the shader tree, into the camera effects panel, and now we can reduce the shutter speed. Let's reduce it to 1/12th of a second. And because we've set the exposure control to photographic in the render output, the shutter speed now also helps to control the exposure. And as you can see, as preview clears up, we do have this sort of subtle depth of field effect, which is quite nice. But if we were to take a close-up shot, the depth of field effect would really come into its own. So let's give this a go. I'm going to open the Render Passes panel again, and I'm going to create a new pass group, which I'm going to call Close-Up. Click OK. Within that pass group, I'm going to create a new render pass, which I'll also call Close-Up. I'm going to enable Auto Add, and then with that done, I'm going to zoom in on my scene by using the preview window to navigate my camera. So to do this, I'll hold Control and Alt, and then just zoom right in to focus on a detail of the shoe. Obviously, everything goes out of focus, so I'm going to need to refocus by hitting Control F. Then I might just rotate it very slightly, maybe zoom in a fraction more and just reposition it. Once I'm happy with the framing, I'll refocus on this detail, and then I'll make sure to click on the Apply button to bake those changes into the render pass. Then I'll disable Auto Add. And I think in this context of a close-up, the depth of field really helps to sell the realism of the shot. So with that demonstration complete, I'm going to come out of the pass group I've just created to return to the default scene state, and I'll collapse the Render Passes panel, and we're ready to move on to the next part of the process.